IJN Yamato, the lead ship of her class of battleships built for the Imperial Japanese Navy. She and her immediate sister, Musashi, were the heaviest and most powerfully armed battleships ever built by anyone, ever. They displaced nearly 72,000 tons at full load and were armed with 9 46cm, 18.1-inch Type 94 main guns, the largest guns ever mounted on a warship. Heavily armored, extremely powerful, the Yamato stood to secure Imperial Japanese supremacy over the oceans with the power of Yamato. No one could possibly stand in their way, and she did absolutely nothing for them. Not a dang thing. She was nearly useless. The reasons for that vary. It wasn't really anything wrong with her necessarily. It was just, a lot of mismanagement, as well as dealing with an enemy that just could not be asked to care. In order to properly discuss the Yamato, which I may occasionally continually pronounce the name of in that tone, because I do think she's just so cool. In the 1930s, the Japanese government got a little ultra-nationalist with the whole military thing and started doing some stuff that really no one liked except themselves. The whole invading of mainland Asia and really everywhere immediately around them and doing horrific things to the general population of those places. It was not a good time, but the plan was to greatly expand the Empire of Japan. They withdrew from the League of Nations in 1934 and renounced any and all treaty obligations, which is super relevant because the Yamatos in and of themselves were just a blatant and direct violation of the Washington Naval Treaty, which they had signed along with America and the UK. France and Italy were a part of it too. The treaty did several things, but the main thing was that it limited the size and power of capital ships, like battleships. They could only be so big, and that was to prevent other nations from getting just a bit carried away. But the thing about treaties is that if you violate them, there has to be enforcements. Someone has to actually punish you for violating it. And when Japan violated it, no one really did anything immediately. Though to be fair, they were pretty secretive about the Yamato's exact specifications. Interestingly, the overall design of the ship was actually meant to deal with America specifically. The planners of these ships recognized that Japan could not hope to keep up with the output of US naval shipyards should a conflict with us break out, which is absolutely correct. So the intent was to create ships that were so large and powerful that they could handle taking on multiple enemy ships at the same time and come out on top. As I mentioned, at full load, they displaced nearly 72,000 tons. They had a length of 263 meters, 862 feet 10 inches, a beam of 38.9 meters, 127 feet 7 inches, and a draft of 11 meters, 36 feet 1 inch. They were powered by 12 Campton boilers, providing 150,000 ship horsepower, and she was pushed forward by 4 propellers, utilizing steam turbines, to a speed of approximately 27 knots. That's 31 miles per hour, which is a pretty decent pace for a ship this size. Her range was roughly 7,200 nautical miles, and she had a crew of over 3,233 to be precise. Her waterline belt armor was 410 millimeters thick. Her deck armor was between 200 and 226 millimeters thick, and the armor on her gun turrets was 650 millimeters thick on the face. She was a beast, and she was laid down on November 4th, 1937. At Kure Naval Shipyard in Hiroshima. Oh, that's some foreshadowing. Anyway, even just building her was a bit of a taxing thing because they had to adapt the dockyard in and of itself to accommodate her because she was so enormous. Her dock was deepened by 1 meter, and gantry cranes capable of lifting up to 350 tons were installed. They also maintained the extreme secrecy, which is actually comedic in retrospect because they were trying to hide the Death Star, basically. And they did this by constructing a canopy over part of the dry dock to screen her from view, which actually did somewhat work, believe it or not. She was launched on August 8th, 1940, with then-Captain, later Vice Admiral, Miyazato Shutoku in command. As I mentioned, her guns, her main armament, was a little unreasonable. She had 9 .45 caliber, 46 centimeter, 18.1 inch, Type 94 guns. The guns themselves, as I mentioned, were the largest ever fitted to a warship, though it is worth mentioning their shells weren't actually as heavy as British 18-inch naval guns. The shells on the Yamato were a bit lighter than those ones had been, but either way, they were really, really big. Each of the individual guns was nearly 70 feet long, weighed over 147 tons, and was capable of firing both high explosive and armor-piercing shells up to 26 miles. And they were not her only teeth. Her secondary battery comprised 12 155mm 6.1-inch guns mounted in 4 triple turrets, 1 forward, 1 aft, and 2 were amidships. She also had 12 12.7cm 5-inch guns in 6 twin mounts, 3 on each side amidships, and those were actually taken from Megami-class cruisers. She also initially had 24 25mm 1-inch anti-aircraft guns, mostly mounted amidships, though, as the war dragged on, that would be drastically increased, but more on that later. In October and November of 1941, Yamato underwent her sea trials, and did quite well. She was a very well-built ship, so she still had some finalization to do, and that was given top priority because Japan was just about to touch our boats! And then they did, and that made us really angry.
I don't even think you really know what a bad day is. But you're gonna find out.
And as far as they were concerned, they needed Yamato right now. She'd be officially commissioned a little over a week after Pearl, December 16th, 1941, months ahead of schedule, at a ceremony at Kure. Immediately after formal commissioning, under Captain, later Vice Admiral, Gihachi Takayanagi, she would join 2 other battleships, Nagato and Mutsu, in the 1st Battleship Division. However, it quickly became apparent that using Yamato for a direct attack on American forces wasn't, well, going to be the first thing they would do. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto knew they had to strike quickly, but he didn't want to do that with battleships at first. He wanted to do it with aircraft, via their carriers. And he planned a pretty large-scale attack at Midway, something that America would actually get wise to and figure out what they were planning. And Yamato was there, technically, she just didn't do anything. On February 12, 1942, Yamato was chosen as the flagship of Yamamoto himself for his combined fleet. And he exercised overall command of the entire battle from Yamato's bridge, but this didn't do anything because, well, frankly, the Battle of Midway was a disaster for Japan. While Yamato could do nothing but just chill and let Yamamoto do whatever Yamamoto was doing, we proceeded to smash 4 of their fleet carriers and take down 332 of their aircraft and some of their most skilled pilots. This was a horrid outcome for Japan. Yamamoto had planned to lure America into a trap and only bring in the battleship group when they were already at the mercy of the carrier forces, but they never got that far because all the carriers died too quickly. And though he had miscalculated, Yamamoto wasn't exactly dumb. He knew that this was bad, and then immediately sailing the battleships into a conflict they were clearly losing was not a good idea. So on June 5th, he ordered the remaining ships to return to Japan, and Yamato withdrew with the main battleship force to Hashirajima before returning to Kure. It wasn't until August 17th, 1942, that she would leave Kure again, heading for Truk. She spent 11 days at sea, and was spotted by an American submarine, USS Flying Fish, who did fire on her. She did try to take down Yamato, but every single torpedo missed. Yamato was able to arrive safely at her destination, and Yamato chilled at Truk during the entirety of the Guadalcanal campaign because she didn't actually have 46-centimeter ammunition suitable for shore bombardment, as well as the fact that they had uncharted areas around Guadalcanal, and Yamato was pretty fuel-intensive due to her size, so Japan decided, yeah, we're not going to send in the big beefy battleship, we're just going to do this some other way, and that didn't go super well. Listen, it's important to understand, Yamato did not do a lot during the war. She was big and impressive, but there really wasn't much she was tasked with. Because, well, Japan started learning this pretty quickly after they lost 4 of their carriers, but carriers were far more useful, it was found, than battleships were. By sending up individual planes that could hit targets more precisely, the carriers also had a lot more range and utility in their way. Battleships were really only good for smashing stuff. And they were really good at that, but not generally against other enemy ships, which is exactly what Yamato was for. Most of our battleships, for example, did a ton of shore bombardment. And to be fair, they did a lot of shore bombardment, a lot of very effective shore bombardment. USS Pennsylvania made her whole career about beating islands into submission. That was like her whole thing. Most of our battleships did that, but Pennsylvania was very particular about that. Yamato never really got the chance to do that much because Japan was on the defense most of the time. They weren't so much taking islands once they got us involved. After Midway, they were trying to keep us out of the territory they'd claimed, and you had touched our boats, and we're not gonna let you forget it. Before the end of 1942, she had a new captain, though. Captain, later Rear Admiral, Chiaka Matsuda, was assigned to command Yamato. It's also important to understand that what Yamato was mostly used for was being a hotel. Even the Japanese sailors called her that, Hotel Yamato, as well as her sister, Hotel Musashi, because instead of actually fighting, a lot of what they tended to do was sit in port and be meeting places for the admirals. The thing about the Yamato-class as a whole is that while they weren't especially overly nice inside, they were nicer than basically every other Imperial Japanese ship. Thus, the admirals liked being on board them because they were just a little bit nicer. And Yamato would start doing that a lot more because on February 11th, 1943, she wasn't even flagship of the combined fleet anymore. She was replaced by her own sister, Musashi. And during her time at Truk, she was only away from there 1 day. Between August of 1942 and May 8th of 1943, she only spent a day at sea. Otherwise, she was at Truk, anchored, chilling, hanging out, doing nothing. But in May, she did set sail for Yokosuka and then back to Kure, arriving on May 14th. Then she was sent to dry dock for 9 days for inspection and some general repairs, and after briefly sailing in Japan's Western Inland Sea, she was sent back to dry dock again in July. This time, she needed more significant refits, and in mid-August, she went back to Truk, where she joined a large task force that had been formed in response to American raids on Tarawa and Makin atolls. She would sortie alongside Nagato in September, as well as 3 carriers, the ones Japan still had left, to intercept U.S. Task Force 15, and then do that again just a month later. And they sat there, waiting for us. Just waiting. They're just waiting. For 6 days. And we never showed. We never showed up. They went back to Truk after that, arriving in late October. In mid-December, Yamato was assigned escort duty for transport Operation B01 from Truk to Yokosuka. And because by this point it was realized by Japan that their battleships had been utterly useless, and they really just needed more carriers, they really didn't feel like using either Yamato or Musashi in actual combat, but they did acknowledge that they were so large that they had a tremendous amount of storage space, and they did have thick armor protection. So, both Yamato and Musashi started being used as very large troop transports. Oh, how humiliating. Remember, these ships were designed to take on entire fleets alone. And now the Imperial Japanese Navy was like, you two, you guys are gonna just be taxis. I hope that's cool. You know, at least Bismarck went out swinging. She was never forced to deal with any of this nonsense. And hey, even Tirpitz got to sit in a very pretty fjord for a long time. Yamato and Musashi are like the frickin' Ubers of Imperial Japan. But on Christmas of 1943, while they were in the middle of their Uber trips, they were intercepted by another American submarine, Skate. Nice, I like that name actually. Skate would fire on her 4 torpedoes, and one actually hit her on a starboard side toward her stern. That ripped a hole that was about 5 meters, 16 feet, below the top of her anti-torpedo bulge. The hole itself was roughly 82 feet across. It was a pretty sizable hit. A joint between her upper and lower armor belts did fail, and that caused her rear turret's upper magazine to flood. She took on roughly 3,000 tons of water, but this was not a mortal wound. She was so large that even a sizable hit was not enough to take her down. She was able to get back to truck later the same day, and a repair ship, Akashi, stabilized her so she could depart on January 10, 1944 for Kure, reaching there a little less than a week later for actual repairs to be conducted on the damage. She'd be placed in dry dock until February 3rd, and received a few modifications. Armor plating that had been sloped at a 45-degree angle was fitted in the area of that damage. And it was even proposed to add a whole bunch of steel, over 5,000 tons, to bolster her defenses, but that was rejected because that would have made her way too heavy. Her displacement and draft would have gone through the roof to the point she would be unstable, so they simply couldn't do that. While she was in dry dock, Captain WWII Morishita, who was the former captain of Battleship Haruna, assumed command of her. And on February 25th, both Yamato and her sister Musashi were reassigned from the 1st Battleship Division to the 2nd Fleet. She'd actually be dry dock again between February 25th to March 18th, 1944, this time for some pretty critical upgrades, including her radar and anti-aircraft systems. Each of the 2 beam-mounted 155mm triple turrets were removed, and these were replaced by 3 pairs of 127mm 5-inch anti-aircraft guns in double mounts. 8 triple and 26 single 25mm anti-aircraft mounts were also added, bringing her total amount of anti-aircraft guns to 186, which was a lot of anti-aircraft guns. But by this point, our carrier forces were utterly smashing Imperial Japan. They needed more anti-aircraft guns. Now! They did add shelters to the upper deck for the increased anti-aircraft crews, though, so for foreshadowing here, that would not actually matter much, but we'll get to that in a bit. Most interestingly, though, she was given a Type 13 air search and a Type 22 Mod 4 surface search/gunnery control radar, and her main mast was altered. Suite for the radars was upgraded to include infrared identification systems, and that meant that Yamato, in particular, was actually one of the best equipped battleships that Japan still had in terms of her guns. She could hit targets really well. She just had to get close enough. She would finally leave Kure again on April 21st. This time, again, as a shuttle, basically, as a friggin' Uber, taxi, whatever you want to call her, as she was taking soldiers and materials for a mission out to Manila, and she arrived at the Philippines on April 28th. Once she did that, she moved on to Malaya to join Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet. In early June of 1944, both she and her sister were again used as troop transports, but this time it was to reinforce the garrison and naval defense of the island of Biak as part of Operation Khan. That mission would be canceled when Ozawa's headquarters heard that American carrier attacks were happening on the Mariana Islands. That forced Japan to reorient themselves and concentrate a majority of their remaining fighting strength in the hope of achieving a decisive victory against the Americans, which they had not been able to do since Pearl Harbor. Since the beginning of the war, they had not decisively beat us. They had some good outcomes occasionally, but it was not going well. But this was June 1944. Most of their fleet was utterly smashed. Their navy was far inferior in numbers and even experience to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. They had lost a lot of their experienced sailors on top of the ships, but they still had both Yamato and Musashi, because they had not let them actually fight, basically. Between June 19th and June 23rd, Yamato in particular would escort forces of Ozawa's mobile fleet during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, though American pilots generally called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. They were just having a good time, really. You did this! You made this happen! You're making us someone we don't want to be! But you had to make us angry! Do you see what happens?
Why do you always do these stupid things? And why do you always announce them to me before you do them? Are you trying to get a rise out of me? Are you happy now? Is this what you want?
Oh, no, it's not what I want. It's not what I want. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
During that particular battle, the Japanese lost 3 more aircraft carriers and 426 aircraft, so they were not winning. And Yamato really only did anything of note when she accidentally opened fire on returning friendly aircraft, on Japanese aircraft. She tried to shoot her own side. It's... Yamato, please. You're killing me. I am dying because you are killing me. Following the battle, which again they lost pretty clearly, Yamato would withdraw with the mobile fleet back to the Hashirajima staging area near Kure to refuel and rearm. Alongside her sister, they left the fleet on June 24th for a short journey to Kure, where she was given even more anti-aircraft guns, 5 more triple 25mm mounts. And also, she was given what they called emergency buoyancy keeping procedures. What does that mean? Well, it was a method to basically make sure that Yamato was even harder to sink. They removed pretty much anything that wasn't ammunition that could be flammable, including linoleum, bedding, mattresses, literally anything that could catch fire that could not also be shot at an enemy. Or fuel, obviously. The mattresses are of particular note because that meant the men on board her, who were used to actually having pretty comfortable accommodations by Imperial Japanese Navy standards, were suddenly sleeping on planks, which could also be used to repair damage. Guys, do you think you're losing yet? I need to... It's an important question. She also had some flammable paints on board, and those received a silicone-based overcoat to protect them from also catching fire. And she was given more portable pumps and firefighting apparatuses to make her much, much, much harder to kill. She finally left Japan on July 8th, accompanied by her sister, as well as Kongo, Nagato, 11 cruisers and destroyers, sailing south. Yamato and her sister headed for the Linga Islands, arriving a little over a week after they had left. Part of the reason they'd been sent out there was that Japan's tanker fleet was basically gone. We had killed a lot of those, and thus major fleet units like the Yamatos were stationed in the East Indies to be near the source of their pretty much only fuel supply. And Yamato chilled there with her sister for the next 3 months, again doing nothing. Between the 22nd and 25th of October of 1944, as part of Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, Yamato would be a part of a huge naval engagement, one of the largest ever in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This was a response to us trying to take back the Philippines, and spoiler, we would succeed at that. But on the Japanese side, they initiated Operation Show Go, calling for a number of Japanese groups to converge on the island of Leyte. In terms of Yamato specifically, well, on October 18th, she was given a coating of black camouflage in preparation of her nighttime trip through the San Bernardino Strait. Her particular group was attacked while in transit to Leyte in the Palawan Passage, on the 23rd of October by two submarines, USS Darter and USS Dace. Those subs were able to sink two Takeo-class heavy cruisers, and that included Kurita's own flagship, Atago. They also had permanently damaged a third, but Kurita did survive and wound up transferring his flag over to Yamato. The next day, she took part in the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. And by take part, I mean basically just got shot at a lot. American carrier aircraft would sortie 259 times. Oh, okay. And the planes from USS Essex in particular would hit Yamato with two armor-piercing bombs, as well as scoring a near miss. She did suffer some damage, taking on 3,370 tons of water, but it was not enough to cripple her. She could still fight, though it is worth mentioning she would lose her sister, Musashi. Musashi became the focus of the American attacks and sank after being hit with 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes. Yamato still had one sister left, Shinano, but Shinano was being converted into an aircraft carrier and not a very good one. She would wind up sinking just the following month, in late November, leaving Yamato all alone. But just after the death of her sister Musashi, Yamato would take part in her only surface action during the entire conflict. See, what Kurita didn't know was that the main American battle group under the command of Admiral William Halsey Jr. had departed Leyte Gulf on the evening of October 24th. Halsey thought that Kurita's center force had been turned back, so he took Task Force 38 in pursuit of the Japanese Northern Force, which was only a diversionary force. As a result, he took the bulk of American surface vessels with him. 5 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, more than 600 aircraft, 6 fast battleships, 8 cruisers, and over 40 destroyers were taken away from the actual problem. And under the cover of darkness, Kurita's force was able to navigate the San Bernardino Strait, and at dawn stumbled upon an American formation that had remained in the area only to provide close support for the invading troops. Yamato was finally given the opportunity to fire upon enemy vessels, the very thing she had been built to do. And to her credit, she did pretty well out there, but recognized that the force they had stumbled upon was not only woefully inferior to them, but at the same time proved to be a little unexpected on the basis that their name was Taffy 3, and Taffy 3 was in no mood. They only had 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, but boy howdy did the destroyers go just a little crazy. And they were helped along by a miscalculation by Kurita, who mistook the escort carriers for full-size fleet carriers. As a result, he ordered his ships to fire armor-piercing ammunition, which was not ideal for the current enemy. Escort carriers and destroyers are fairly lightly armored, and generally you want to use high explosive rounds against them, not armor-piercing. The armor-piercing rounds, I mean, they pierced through them, but they went all the way through them, over-penetrating and not exploding in them. Still doing damage, obviously, but not nearly as much as if they just exploded on impact. But Yamato put in work, as it was her only opportunity to do so. She scored the first damage of the battle. On her third salvo, one of her shells exploded just underneath the keel of the escort carrier USS White Plains, and that knocked out her boiler and electrical power for 3 minutes. That had been repaired, but her hull was so badly twisted from the explosion that she would never see frontline service ever again, demoted to just an aircraft ferry. That was the power of Yamato, when they actually let her do what she was supposed to do. A single shot, a single near miss, literally crippled an escort carrier permanently. At 7:30, Yamato would spot what they called a U.S. cruiser and prepared to fire upon her. It wasn't a cruiser, to be clear. That was USS Johnston. And USS Johnston was going a little ham at the time. She had just finished a torpedo charge which had blown the bow of the heavy cruiser Kumano off, as in off. So that was neat. She also hadn't been hit at all. But Yamato fired a full broadside, which did hit Johnston with 3 direct strikes of her shells. Then she started firing her secondary guns, hitting Johnston with an additional 3 of her smaller shells. That did significant damage, but didn't actually stop Johnston from doing what she was gonna do. Yamato did record her as sunk because she just disappeared behind a rain squall, but Johnston would stay afloat for a bit longer, continuing to fight, mostly because Yamato had hit her, but with armor-penetrating shells, not high-explosive shells. Though it did cripple Johnston significantly for the rest of the engagement, and it did injure her own commander, Ernest E. Evans, who lost 2 of his fingers as well as his shirt. This man was insane, okay? He was in spitting distance of a shell fired from Yamato, and he just wound up looking cooler. Bro's like the Rambo of the Navy over here. Like, the man did not care, alright? But after Johnston retreated, Yamato resumed firing on the escort carriers, but at the time they were pretty far away, so she wasn't able to zero in on any hits. At 7:50, the Japanese battleships were attacked by 2 more destroyers, USS Hoel and Herman. Hoel in particular would actually fire at Yamato and hit her with 2 127mm shells, which did basically nothing because it's Yamato, but the audacity on display. At 7:54, both destroyers launched torpedoes. They weren't actually aiming for Yamato. They had targeted Haruna, but they missed Haruna, and Yamato had been right behind her. So Yamato had to turn to evade as well, and she wound up being caught in between both spreads, pushing her out of the fight for about 10 minutes or so. Some accounts from US sailors state Yamato never came back to the fight, but that isn't true. She did return. Once the torpedoes were no longer a factor, she made contact with Taffy 3 again at around 8:10 and immediately began firing at the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay. She would strike Gambier Bay with her first salvo and continued hammering on the poor escort carrier, doing significant damage. By 8:30, the American destroyers started trying to cover Gambier Bay, and most of the Japanese warships would fire on them, but Yamato chose to continue shooting at Gambier with her main battery. Gambier Bay would begin to list more to port, and Yamato would use her secondary battery to re-engage Hoel, who got shredded by fire from Yamato, alongside Nagato and Haguro. By 8:43, the abandoned ship order was issued on Gambier Bay, and that resulted in Yamato ceasing fire because they could see everyone abandoning her, and they were like, okay, we can shoot at something else now. Taffy 3 was beginning to wear down despite fighting so fiercely. Yamato had been responsible for sinking or helping to sink every single one of the targets except escort carrier Samuel B. Roberts, who had not actually been targeted by Yamato. She was targeted by other ships, but regardless, she was doing well. But the escort carriers had been launching planes, and the air attacks had taken their toll. They lost 3 of their heavy cruisers from those. Because of Taffy 3's ability to just be terrifying, Kurita thought he was fighting a much larger force, and he concluded that he had sunk at least 2 fleet carriers, 2 cruisers, and 2 destroyers, which no, you had not. And he was afraid of further air attacks causing more losses, so he ordered all ships, including Yamato, to fall back. Taffy 3 had driven off Yamato, though only because Kurita made the wrong call at the time. But they had succeeded in protecting the American troop convoys, which had been the primary thing. Kurita's job was to destroy those, and he never was able to. And as Yamato retreated, she was attacked by aircraft from USS Hornet, and took damage from 2 more bombs, one of which destroyed some of the crew quarters, and the other hitting turret number 1. Yamato, alongside the rest of the force, returned to Brunei, and on November 15th, 1944, the 1st Battleship Division was disbanded, and Yamato was made the flagship of the 2nd Fleet. On November 21st, while transiting the East China Sea in a withdrawal to Kure Naval Base, they were attacked again by a submarine. This time was USS Sea Lion. Sea Lion tore them up. Battleship Kongo and destroyer Urikaze were both lost. Yamato had to be dry docked for further repairs and more anti-aircraft upgrades. On November 25th, Captain Aruga Kosaku was named her commander, and he would be her last commander. On January 1st, 1945, after having her upgrades, Yamato, Haruna, and Nagato were all transferred to the newly reactivated 1st Battleship Division, but that didn't last very long. It lasted a little over a month. That division would be deactivated again on February 10th, and then Yamato was sent to the 1st Carrier Division instead. She wound up participating in a battle, and by battle I mean she was under attack, due to TG-58.1 attacking Kure Harbor where she was. American carrier aircraft began pretty much doing the same thing to Kure as Japan had done to Pearl, honestly, though Yamato herself only took minor damage for 2 main reasons. One, she was no longer in dry dock, and despite her being large and easy to hit, she could maneuver. But also, there was a nearby squadron of Kawanishi N1K1 Shiden fighters, which were called George by the Allies. These planes were not only very good, but also flown by veteran Japanese fighter instructors at the time. They put up a pretty good fight against our carrier forces and minimized what could have been catastrophic damage, and that allowed Yamato to survive long enough to be turned into the largest kamikaze anything ever. Yeah, what? Well, okay, she wasn't gonna blow herself up, though she was gonna allow herself to be blown up. Here's what was going on. Operation 10 Go. We were gearing up for a planned invasion of the Japanese mainland, and the last step to do that was to take Okinawa, which we would invade on April 1st. The Japanese Navy did not have a lot of answers to this anymore because they had lost most of their forces, but they still had Yamato. And their plan, their genius idea, was really stupid, but it was a plan. The intention was to send Yamato, as well as 9 escorts, a single cruiser, Yahagi, and 8 destroyers, to Okinawa. Their job was to directly confront the Allied forces invading the island, alongside kamikaze units and the Okinawa-based army units. Once the Allied forces were pushed back, Yamato would be intentionally beached on Okinawa. Now, why in the blue heck would they do that? Well, it was a very similar concept to what Germany had tried to do with Tirpitz towards the end of the war. Remember, they tried to make her a permanent gun battery emplacement. Yamato was basically going to do the same thing, though in a much cruder fashion. They were just going to beach her to act as an unsinkable gun emplacement. She and her crew were under orders to fight until destroyed. As I said, largest kamikaze anything. That was how Yamato was supposed to go out. Great. She was given a full stock of ammunition on March 29th, and according to plan, she was only supposed to take enough fuel for a one-way voyage to Okinawa since, well, she was going to beach herself and not actually go anywhere ever again. But she was given more than intended, on the authority of the local base commanders who chose to give her up to 60% of her total fuel capacity. This was likely because she actually wasn't supposed to beach herself until driving some of our forces back, so she would have to maneuver. So maybe they were like, yeah, we still need her to float around, and maybe they were hoping she'd do something amazing and not actually have to beach herself, you know? Maybe she'd be a one-woman army and take on the entirety of the American invaders. How dare they do this to us? It's not like we did it first! The ships left Tokuyama at 1520 on April 6, and while underway, the destroyers decided to practice torpedo runs on Yamato in preparation for battle. Operation 10 Go was to be secret. Obviously, they didn't want them to know they were sending one of their last major powerhouses still floating directly to Okinawa, but the Allies had intercepted and decoded the radio transmissions and figured out what the Japanese were planning to do with Yamato. Presumably after they got done laughing, they started organizing a way to counteract this. Further confirmation would come as the Japanese force navigated the Bungo Strait. They were spotted by 2 American submarines, Threadfin and Hackleback. Neither were able to attack due to their speed, as well as the fact the force was zigzagging significantly, but they did let their allies know, hey, Yamato's coming. She's right there. Interesting. Admiral Raymond Spruance ordered 6 battleships already engaged in shore bombardment to instead prepare for surface action against Yamato, but those orders would be countermanded, much to Spruance's disappointment. He wanted his battleships to sink their battleship. It was going to be a good time, and you had to go and ruin it because we have carriers, man. And Admiral Mark Mixture's aircraft carriers were instead gonna just take out Yamato on her way, not even let her get close to Okinawa, which, alright, that makes sense. As a contingency, though, the battleships, alongside 7 cruisers and 21 destroyers, were sent to intercept the Japanese force before they could reach Okinawa, just in case the aircraft failed. But spoiler alert, the aircraft would not fail. Not at all. Yamato's crew were at general quarters and ready for anti-aircraft action by the dawn of April 7th. Scout planes would make contact with her at 8:23. Yamato would fire beehive shells at them, but not actually take them down and wouldn't prevent them from shadowing them at all. Oh, by the way, the beehive shells, yeah, we should probably talk about those real quick. They're going to come up a little bit during this story because Yamato did use them. They were known as San Shiki Dan, and they were basically a shrapnel and incendiary anti-aircraft round used by Japan, sometimes called beehive rounds. They basically created a large volume of flame in the air when they were fired. It could be fired from Yamato's main guns. They were meant to basically give her even more anti-aircraft weapons. Her main guns normally wouldn't have been able to really do anything about aircraft, but with the beehive shells, in theory, she could make big booms in the sky, and that would take down enemy planes, right? No, the beehive rounds really didn't do anything. They weren't really enough. They did explode, but unless they exploded immediately next to the plane, they really had no hope of actually bringing one down. Most Allied pilots considered them pretty fireworks displays and not at all a threat. Regular anti-aircraft rounds and flak guns, on the other hand, could do damage, but the beehive shell's not really very effective. Anyway, Yamato did finally spot aircraft on her radar at 10 o'clock. Just an hour after that, F-6F Hellcat fighters appeared overhead to deal with any Japanese aircraft that might appear to protect Yamato. Japan didn't have, any aircraft left. No planes appeared to help Yamato. She was on her own. She and the 1 cruiser and 8 destroyers. This was not good. At roughly 12:30, 280 bomber and torpedo bomber aircraft arrived over the Japanese force. Oh no! One of the destroyers, Asashimo, had actually fallen out of formation because of engine issues, and she was just absolutely wrecked by aircraft from USS San Jacinto. The rest of the force did follow standard Japanese protocol by having the fastest destroyers circle Yamato, while they overall made their way through the ocean at roughly 28 miles per hour, and the first aircraft finally swooped into attack at 12:37. Yahagi, the cruiser, would turn and race away at 35 knots, 40 miles per hour, trying to draw away some of the planes off of Yamato, but very few actually fell for this. Yamato was clearly the main target. And the thing about this is it's often portrayed as a pretty sad way for her to go out, but to be clear, Yamato got rolled here. Quite literally, actually. But no one could say she didn't go out fighting. Much like Germany's Bismarck, while they both suffered sad and brutal ends, they kept fighting until the very last moment, and Yamato was not gonna just lay down and die.
Yamato, Empress of the waves on high, reigning queen now paints the sky. She'll never yield, she'll never relent. The true goddess fights until she's spent. Yamato, Empress of the waves on high, reigning queen now paints the sky. She'll never yield, she'll never relent. The true goddess fights until she's spent. Yamato!
She wasn't hit for 4 minutes, though at 12:41, 2 bombs did hit 2 of her triple 25mm anti-aircraft mounts, as well as blowing a hole in her deck. And at this point, it's probably worth mentioning that there was a bit of a problem with the anti-aircraft mounts in general. remember how I said they gave them some cover? Yeah, it wasn't nearly enough. Because once our aircraft dropped their bombs, they didn't just stop attacking. They would often start strafing the deck of enemy ships. And those strafe runs didn't usually do too much to the ships themselves. But they did tear the crew apart. And that was slowly becoming Yamato's major problem. Once the bombs were dropped, the attacking planes would strafe her decks, killing her crew. And suddenly, she didn't have hardly anyone left to man the anti-aircraft guns, which were in no way sufficient even if they were fully manned to combat a force of this size. A third bomb would destroy her radar room and the starboard aft 127mm mount. At 12:45, a single torpedo hit her far forward on her port side. At 12:46, another 2 bombs struck her on the port side. Following this, 2 or 3 more torpedoes hit Yamato. I say 2 or 3 because it's still debated on the third one. Definitely 2 hit her on the port side near her engine room and one of the boiler rooms. The third is argued about, but a third would explain why at this point flooding was reported in her auxiliary steering room. So it was probably 3, we still aren't sure. She was being hit a lot. This first wave was finally over at 12:47, leaving her significantly damaged. She was listing between 5 to 6 degrees to port, and was deliberately counter-flooded, trying to reduce that list, bringing it down to just 1 degree, which wasn't terrible, and only one of her boiler rooms had been disabled. That did reduce her speed somewhat, but only slightly. It wasn't like a big deal. The biggest deal was the strafing runs I mentioned earlier. A lot of her gun crews, and I mean a lot of her gun crews, were either seriously injured or just outright dead. And that was only the first wave. They knew full well that there was another one coming. The second attack started just before 1300 hours, 1 o'clock. This time, dive bombers flew high overhead, while torpedo bombers approached from all directions just above sea level. There was an insane number of planes this time too, and Yamato didn't have a lot of options, so she did everything she could, including both firing her regular anti-aircraft guns as well as her main battery with beehive shells. They set the beehive shells to explode after just a second, just 3,300 feet away from the ship. The idea was to kill as many planes as possible by just fire everything in all directions. But, as I mentioned, the beehive shells were nearly useless. They really didn't work as intended. They did explode, but the explosions weren't strong enough to actually take down aircraft. Meaning that, for the most part, her turrets were just blowing hot air. Quite literally. Perhaps a more dramatic way to go out, and she was doing her best. There was just too many enemies. 3 or 4 torpedoes struck her on the port side, as well as 1 to starboard. And that did really bad damage, causing her list to get much worse, between 15 to 18 degrees to port. They counter-flooded again, but that only brought it down to 10 degrees, and they really couldn't counter-flood anymore. I mean, they could. It would require actual repairs or flooding the starboard engine and fire rooms, which they really could not afford to do. Now, they had gotten the flooding somewhat under control. She still wasn't going to sink, but the list was bad enough that her main battery couldn't fire anymore, and her speed was now limited to 18 knots, just 21 miles per hour, which was a legitimate problem. And they also recognized that this wasn't over. There was more coming, and yes, a third attack began at 1340. At least 4 bombs hit her superstructure, causing serious casualties among her gun crews. I mean, the ones that were left after the strafing attacks anyway. There were a ton of near misses, but the shock of those explosions dented her outer plating, compromising her torpedo defenses. 4 more torpedoes did strike her during this wave, 3 exploding on her port side, increasing water flow into the port inner engine room, flooding another fire room, and the steering gear room. The auxiliary steering room was already underwater at the time, so she lost maneuverability and became stuck in a starboard turn. Oh, being stuck in a turn after a torpedo hit, really? Man, I've never seen that before. The 4th torpedo hit probably hit the starboard outer engine room, which was being counter-flooded to reduce the port list. But this damage was far too great to overcome. There was too much water coming in, there were too many holes in the ship. She was dying, bleeding. And at 1402, the order to abandon her was given. Her speed was only 12 miles per hour, 10 knots, and her list was getting much worse. Her fires were completely out of control, and there was no hope of stopping them. Most alarmingly, there were critical temperatures being reported in the forward main battery magazines. Normally, they would flood the magazines to prevent them from, exploding? But the pumping stations had been knocked out, they couldn't do it. Yamato was in danger of suffering a catastrophic failure. Just 3 minutes later, Yahagi, the cruiser, would sink, she herself being hit by 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes. At that same time, yet another wave of torpedo bombers attacked Yamato from her starboard side. But her list was so bad that those torpedoes wound up hitting the bottom of her hull, not the side, and she continued to roll over to port. By 1420, she lost power and her 25mm anti-aircraft guns started falling off of her. At 1423, she finally capsized and began to sink. But that was not the last thing she did, because remember I mentioned the increased temperatures in her forward main battery magazines? Yeah, those hadn't flooded yet. And that was a problem, because as she was capsizing and sinking and the roll reached around 120 degrees, one of the two bow magazines blew up. And I mean, really blew up. After that, she sank very quickly. And of the 3,332 men she had aboard, 3,055 would die, including both the fleet commander, Vice Admiral Saichi Ito, and her captain, Aruga. Both chose to go down with her. Only 4 destroyers from the task force made it through, and the survivors were recovered by them. And at that point, they were like, we're going back to Japan. The mission's a complete failure. We're done. Everything's over. Holy crap, what was that? And with that, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the heaviest and most heavily armed battleship ever constructed was gone. Laid to rest, along with her sisters, Musashi and Shinano. For many years, it wasn't exactly known where Yamato was underneath the ocean. But drawing on U.S. records, an expedition to the East China Sea in 1982 did produce some results, but the wreckage couldn't be identified at the time. A second expedition occurred 2 years later, and photographic and video records were later shown to one of Yamato's still living designers, Shigeru Makino. He took one look at it and confirmed that it was her, Yamato. She lies 290 kilometers, 180 miles southwest of Kyushu, under 340 meters, 1,120 feet of water in 2 pieces. A bow section that comprises her front 1/3 and a separate stern section. And despite the fact that she did nothing during the war, she had very little chance to do anything, one can't help but feel some sympathy for Yamato herself. Because, as her experience with TAVI 3 showed, she was very capable. She hit most of the targets she shot at, and had Japan actually let her fight, she might have been able to do something. Probably not change the outcome of the war, because aircraft exist. But hey, she wasn't like a bad ship at all. It was built pretty well, and it took a lot to bring her down. And they still hold a lot of cultural significance in modern-day Japan, due to their extreme size as well as their impressive engineering. And while they may no longer exist, utterly destroyed by an enemy that you made angry, you woke up the sleeping giant. Actually, fun tangent, that quote, the waking up the sleeping giant thing that Yamamoto said, that he never actually said that. That's a complete fabrication. That's misinformation. Do not believe that. That quote comes from a movie, Tora Tora Tora, about Pearl Harbor. In reality, he never actually said that, though he was seriously concerned about American industrial capacity completely outpacing their own, which is why he tried to stop us early on and then failed, and then we completely outpaced them with our industrial capacity and just blew everything to kingdom come. And yeah, you shouldn't have touched the boats, man! You shouldn't have done that! Because you touched ours, so we took yours. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.